Matter flows through the biosphere, starting from plants and the process of photosynthesis and returning to the soil through the action of decomposers. Hi, today's lesson we're going to talk about the web of life. So, we're going to talk about different roles of organisms in ecosystems first. The first role is producers or autotrophs. Now, these are organisms that use light energy to synthesize sugars through photosynthesis. So, autotroph really means self feeder. Producers produce organic compounds that will serve as food for other organisms, whether it's leaves, berries, roots, or shoots. They rely on sunlight, water, and nutrients from the soil and the air. Consumers or heterotrophs rely on producers as a source of food. So herbivores rely directly on producers for food. They consume plants, algae, or plankton. And those would be primary consumers or herbivores that eat plants. Now, continuing on with consumers, we can have secondary consumers that feed on primary consumers. Tertiary consumers feed on secondary consumers. And both secondary and tertiary consumers typically could be carnivores because they're going to kill and eat other animals. Most carnivores are animals, but there are a few carnivorous plants, such as the Venus flytrap. So for a tertiary consumer, it would be like the hawk that's going to eat the snake that ate the mouse. So the mouse was the primary consumer, the snake was a secondary consumer, then the hawk was the tertiary consumer. Other roles in the ecosystem include omnivores that will feed on both plants and animals depending on availability. So things like bears, humans, skunks, raccoons, even different birds. Scavengers are animals that feed on dead or decaying animals that they did not kill themselves, like vultures. And then decomposers, they have a very important role because they're organisms that break down decaying matter into simpler molecules and returning it into the environment, either the soil or the water. So when we look at a prairie grassland ecosystem, we can see the category of producer uses photosynthesis to convert light energy into chemical energy. Then we have herbivores that are primary consumers, carnivores, primary and tertiary consumers that obtain energy from plants and animals, and then scavengers and decomposers. Now, the role of the herbivore or primary consumer would be to obtain energy from producers, green plants, and algae. And some examples would be mice, bison, cows, and prairie dogs. Carnivores obtain their energy from herbivores, like the cowbird or the swift fox. Tertiary consumers obtain energy from other carnivores. So often in prairie ecosystems, these will be birds. They'll eat animals that have already eaten another consumer. Omnivores obtain energy from both plants and animals, and examples would be skunks or sparrows. Scavengers consume energy from primary, secondary, or there can be primary, secondary, or tertiary consumers, and they obtain energy from animals or plants that did not kill themselves, like the coyote or the magpie. Coyotes can also be predators. And then a decomposer obtains its energy from dead organic matter by breaking it down into simpler molecules like bacteria or fungi. When we're looking at the flow of energy through an ecosystem, we want to look at the first law of thermodynamics, which is that energy can be changed from one form to another, but it cannot be created or destroyed. So the total amount of energy and matter in the universe remains constant. So, in order for an ecosystem to persist, energy must flow from one to another, from the sun to plants to herbivores to carnivores to decomposers. And energy then is going to flow into the ecosystem in the form of solar energy. And most of the energy flows out of an ecosystem in the form of heat from animals, homeostasis, and motion. So after the sun's energy is converted by photosynthesis, the energy is now stored in chemical bonds of different glucose and starches. Sugars, starches, and fats and proteins are now going to be the complex organic molecules that store energy in the chemical bonds of animals. When an organism digests food, it breaks down these bonds and releases usable energy to maintain homeostasis, cellular activity, and moving around to meet its needs. We can look at an ecosystem also in the form of an energy pyramid, which divides up all the species into an ecosystem based on their energy and source. Are they a producer, consumer, and then what level of consumer are they? Now, each level in this pyramid is called a trophic level. So producers will maintain the first trophic level, and herbivores, or primary consumers, the second trophic level, and then we'll move on up. Now, moving between trophic levels is never going to be very efficient, and only about 10% of the energy moves on from one trophic level to the next. Most of the energy is lost as waste and heat. So here we can see that energy pyramid where sunlight enters at the bottom. We have our producers, primary consumers of herbivores, secondary consumers, and then tertiary consumers that eat other carnivores. So solar energy is going to, at the very bottom, represent about 100% of the energy available. And only about 1% is used by plants in the process of photosynthesis. Some of it's reflected off the surface of the earth, some of it's absorbed by the atmosphere, some of it's absorbed by the surface of the earth. So about 1% of that energy is used in photosynthesis. Only 0.1% of that, or 10%, is passed on to the primary, the first trophic level, or producers. And this is going to be stored in the form of their chemical bonds in plant matter. Then about 10% of that will be passed on to the primary consumers, 10% to the secondary consumers, and 10% to the tertiary consumers. So of the energy that went from the primary consumers to the secondary consumers, it's not destroyed, it's just lost to the environment as heat for those animals maintaining homeostasis and moving around. So now, once we move up each trophic level, an animal requires a greater volume of food to obtain the necessary energy. So a grasshopper at a primary consumer consumes about 0.1 gram of grass per day, where a peregrine falcon must consume 500 grams a day, typically of other birds that would have eaten grasshoppers. So another period that we can see is a biomass pyramid. So we can see that there's the same organisms in it. Algae, snails, stickleback fish, and northern pike. However, this is going to tell us the mass of organisms, dry mass. We've taken the water out. It doesn't contain usable energy in each level of the pyramid. So we have about 3,000 kilograms of algae, 200 kilograms of snails and other invertebrates, 15 kilograms of a secondary consumer or little fish minnows, and about 1 kilogram of our tertiary consumer, or for example, our northern pike. We can also have a pyramid of numbers, which tells us the number of individuals in each trophic level. So except for an ecosystem that has a lot of large trees as its producers, typically we have more producers than we have primary consumers. And then we'll have more primary consumers than secondary consumers, and more secondary consumers than tertiary consumers. So as we go up the pyramid, the number of organisms typically decreases, but the size of organisms will typically increase. In general, for this graph, that it takes about 1 million producers to sustain 2 tertiary consumers. So it puts the tertiary consumers in a fragile situation, and most endangered species are near the top of the pyramid. And it takes a lot of that biomass to support all the way up. It's very rare to see ecosystems that contain more than tertiary consumers, more than 4 levels. We will see them occasionally in aquatic ecosystems because we have a variety of sizes of fish as we go through. But then again, we look at the top to those like polar bears, walruses, killer whales, and we see that they typically are much lower in number than organisms below it on the ecosystem pyramid. We can also look at food chains in an ecosystem. Now, this will show us the flow of energy from producer all the way through the levels of consumer, but only following one path. So grass, grasshopper, bluebird, snake, owl. And at any of those points, we could have also drawn a line to a decomposer. So the grass could go to the decomposer, the grasshopper to the decomposer, so on and so forth. But we only show one connection between the different organisms, as opposed to our food web, which gives a much more detailed account of the interactions between species. Now, these food webs are made up of several food chains that intersect or overlap. So the snake might eat the bird or the frog, the fox might eat the bird or the chipmunk, and the plant is eaten by the chipmunk, the bird, the caterpillar, and the butterfly. So we have lots more interactions in the food web ecosystems than the food chain ones. So just for your information, in between pages 425 and 431, there are specific diagrams for Alberta ecosystems in your textbook. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. Bye.